Welcome everyone to this month's Graeco-Aegyptiaca. Today we're very fortunate to have Ian Moyer from the University of Michigan. I first learned about Ian's work when I read his marvelous book, Egypt and the Limits of Hellenism, published in 2011, which was really mind-opening and exciting for me, and put a whole new enabled me to get a whole new understanding of particularly of Herodotus, who is always one of my favorite authors. And he's working currently on a book project entitled At the Gates of the Temple, studying the gates and forecourts of Egyptian temples as places of communication and interaction and translation, connecting indigenous Egyptians and the Ptolemaic state. And he's going to give us a piece of that, sort of Aeschylean slice from that particular banquet today. He's a cultural historian. He works obviously on ancient Greece and Egypt, ethnicity and culture in the ancient world, and religion and magic. And he's published on the cult of Isis, on Apuleius, on court culture in Ptolemaic Egypt, and on Herodotus as well. And I'm very happy to welcome you, Ian, and we're really looking forward to your paper today, which is entitled Deliberating in the Open, the Public Areas of the Ptolemaic Egyptian Temple. And thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's lovely to be here, and as I was just saying, it's nice to, in this, dispersed intellectual community that we live in, to have chances like this to get together online and see some familiar names and faces. As Peter mentioned, and first of all, I guess let me just quickly check. Can everybody see my slides? Let me just share my screen, and before I go too far, let me make sure the slides are working. And okay, and that's
it's working.
That
it's
worked.
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, good. So I need to go backwards though, to the beginning. Okay, great. And it sounds like everyone can hear me okay, so I'll begin. So as Peter mentioned, I'm presenting material from a book I'm writing on the open areas of Egyptian temples in the first millennium BCE as central public places in their urban landscapes. Places that I would like to argue are comparable to better known sites in the ancient Mediterranean, such as, for example, the Greek agora. And the book covers various dimensions of the open, as I'm calling this area, but one of them is its function as a site of political and legal deliberation. And to explore that, I would like to begin with a moment of deliberation by Egyptian priests in a temple. In the 5th year of the reign of Ptolemy III Philometor, on the 10th day of the Egyptian month Phauphi, that's December 3rd, 243 BCE, a council of priests from all over Egypt met at a temple of Isis in Alexandria and passed a decree honoring the king. The temple may have been the one founded by Alexander, in the center of the city when he laid out Alexandria almost 90 years earlier. By the time the priests gathered there, it had become a site for the worship of the divine ancestral couples of the Ptolemaic dynasty alongside Isis. And the same temple was used at least one other time, possibly more, as a meeting place for such an assembly. At the gates of this temple, or just inside, in an open courtyard, the priests gathered in substantial, although uncertain numbers, anywhere from 40 or 50 to perhaps hundreds of them. The decree they passed took a novel form. It followed the pattern of honorific decrees enacted by councils or assemblies of Greek states or leagues in the wider Mediterranean world, but it was composed in 3 versions, one in Greek, one in Demotic, and one in the classical Egyptian language in hieroglyphic script. This was the first known decree in a series issued over the next 80 years or so, around 243 to 161 BCE. And the most famous of these, of course, is the text inscribed on the Rosetta Stone. The form of the text was novel, but the practice of meeting and deliberating in the open part of the temple was not entirely. The priestly elites of Egyptian towns and cities, in adapting a new genre for formal communications with their Macedonian Greek rulers in Alexandria, translated not only between languages, but also between places, practices, and discourses. In making equivalences, the authors of the decrees reimagined and reaffirmed prerogatives of deliberation and decision-making that they had long exercised in the open part of the temple, and that contributed to shaping that place physically and in the way that the place was understood or imagined. In earlier Egyptian tradition, to issue a decree had been the traditional capacity of the pharaoh, not of priests, as many people have remarked. And the Egyptian terms used to translate the new Greek genre suggest that the priests were aware of that and were evoking local councils of priests and panels of judges, both of which had exercised their authority in the open part of the temple. These deliberative bodies served as a template or rough equivalent for imagining the political status and capacities of Egyptian priests in a multilingual, multicultural regime. Both the decrees and the practice of administering justice were rooted in and framed by a common place, the open part of the temple, a place that local priestly elites understood not only as a stage for manifesting the eternal power of God and Pharaoh, its religious functions, but also as a site for the messier process of doing business, articulating justice and correct conduct, or ma'at, in historical time rather than in divine time. So I'll be talking about this place as the open, and I'm borrowing this term in a way from a general term, uba, a hieroglyphic and sometimes Demotic Egyptian term that is used to refer to the open space or forecourt of a temple, including its drama sometimes, which makes its way into Coptic, and it's been identified in various studies as a general term for these open areas of the temple. And in exploring the space through the decrees, first I want to talk about the ways that the decrees translate practices of deliberation by referring to times, agents, and places in which deliberation took place, or through which deliberation took place, and then talk about some analogs, these prior and contemporary practices, which might be alluded to by the decrees, in order to think about the possibilities of imagining the space in which they were passed as an open or public place. So let me begin with talking about the decrees a little. So from 243 BCE to 162 or 1, at least 7 to 10 decrees were passed by assemblies of Egyptian priests in honor of Ptolemaic rulers, and these have survived in about 30 inscriptions, well preserved and fragmentary, discovered on multiple stelae and even on a temple wall at sites throughout Egypt. Already in the 19th century, scholars identified elements of these texts that had parallels in contemporary decrees honoring kings and other major benefactors of a community. These elements include a general structure, and it might be a little small to see, but trust me, this is a little table showing the general structure and parallels between the Ptolemaic decrees and Hellenistic honorific decrees. These elements of structure include a preamble announcing when the decree was passed and who passed it, the body with the authority to do so, and then various considerations that motivated the decree, a propitiatory and resolution formulas that introduced the enactment of the honors, all of which concluded with instructions for inscribing and erecting the decree in a visible place. In the Greek version, set words and phrases were adapted from the conventions and typical vocabulary of Hellenistic decrees, but in the Demotic Egyptian and hieroglyphic texts, the priests also found equivalents for these in their existing lexical repertoires. There's been extensive debate over over who exactly authored these texts, the directions of translation, and whether there was one, quote, source text that served as a basis for the two other target texts. I think in the most plausible scenario, the Egyptian priests, as the texts themselves say, composed the decrees, albeit in communication with the royal court. And while they may have created a Greek text as an initial model, the process of producing the final decree as a ramified text in 3 versions would have involved a dialogical process of revision in which Egyptian terms and concepts were translated or imported into the Greek versions and vice versa, the Greek version and vice versa. Whatever the process was, it would have required literate bilingual individuals familiar with Greek genres of discourse and comparable Egyptian traditions. These could certainly be found among the Egyptian elite at this time. The priest Manetho, after all, composed his Aegyptiaca, a history in Greek based on Egyptian sources and genres in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, around the time of the first decree or a few years earlier. Figures like Manetho could well have played key roles in drafting the decrees. They would have had models at hand in Alexandria or in the polis of Ptolemais, founded by Ptolemy Soter in Upper Egypt, both of which were endowed with civic governments that issued decrees honoring prominent individuals. There's also reason to believe that the assembled Egyptian priests alluded to contemporary decrees honoring Hellenistic kings in the wider Mediterranean world at just the time when there was a great convergence taking place in the form of the Greek city-state and its political practices. and that the priests were engaging perhaps with shared discourses, emerging in wider networks of interaction among contemporary polities. But the assembled priests were not just translating a foreign genre, they were also asserting their status and capacities by putting themselves into a role that was politically legible to the Ptolemaic court. That is, the representative body of citizens or a representative body of a league or federation, political forms that were still accorded respect even in a Hellenistic world dominated by kings. Now, on the other hand, this shouldn't be interpreted as a colonial mimicry of the hegemonic culture on the part of Egyptian priests, or as merely a superficial rhetorical exercise aimed at currying favor with the dynasty. In the process of translating between languages and making equivalences, the priests were politely equivocal about the universality of Hellenistic political idioms, and they were articulating their own traditions in response to them. Now, these traditions included, of course, pharaonic kingship and its duties, for the decrees typically praise the Ptolemies for performing the ancient and traditional duties of the pharaoh, such as supporting the temples, caring for the sacred animals, restoring statues of the gods, providing for the people in times of famine, securing military victory against Egypt's enemies, and so on and so forth. In the context of Egypt in the first millennium BCE, however, they were also pointing out local forms of authority that had gradually devolved upon priests and temples with the decline of the new kingdom's centralized administrative apparatus. The terms used to identify the context and agents of the decree as guarantors of its legitimacy and the equivalences and equivocations between Greek and Egyptian terms show that the priests assembled in the open part of the temple understood themselves as a deliberative body capable of making decisions, but in a particular way and in a particular place. So I'd like to go through a few of these elements of the decrees that situate it in a context and show how this is important to understanding what the Egyptian priests were doing with these, and also how it reveals things about how the context was understood. So, one of the reasons I'm going through this is an authoritative genre like a decree often includes pragmatic signals that identify it as a particular genre and as an efficacious or felicitous speech act, to draw on J.L. Austin's terms. And these signals include the context of the discourse, and so that's why I'm going through these before proceeding to what they referred to in a physical sense. So the key terms and phrases that stipulated the context and agents of the decree are found at the beginning and the end, in the preamble, and in the final instructions for engraving and setting up the inscription. The first part represents the initial context in which the decree was pronounced. The last part, the context in which the inscribed version of the original utterance was to be displayed. In the preamble, the dating formula situated the decrees in multiple temporalities through two double elements, and I've tried to show this a little bit on the screen here. The year was given both as a regnal year of the king, usually with full pharaonic titulary, and as a civil year in Alexandria, named according to the priests of Alexander and the Ptolemaic dynasty in the capital. The month and day were indicated by the Macedonian lunar calendar, also part of the civil calendar at Alexandria, and by the Egyptian solar calendar, sometimes described as the civil calendar of Egypt. This double temporal reference pointed to a double spatial context, the city of Alexandria and the land of Egypt. The pattern of double dating, however, was not created solely for this purpose. It had been adopted in 265-4 BCE in formal demotic contracts, sesh contracts, about 20 years prior to the first decree and somewhat earlier in the Greek contracts. The decrees, therefore, followed the formalities of legal documents drafted by temple scribes, a reference point to which we'll return. The decrees also mention a particular context, a particular occasion of enactment. While Greek decrees sometimes mention a formal civic occasion on which the decree was passed, such as an assembly meeting and the prytany in which it occurred, the Egyptian decrees instead mention different moments, a dynastic festival, the installation of a sacred bull, or the celebration of a military victory. Rather than conforming to a schedule of council and assembly meetings at Alexandria or elsewhere, the priestly assemblies were held at moments of significance for the sacred life of Egypt and the institution of kingship. There were also many other assemblies of the Egyptian priests whose occasions are entirely unknown, of course, aside from these ones on the screen. Priestly assemblies were held annually until 196 BCE, when the requirement to attend them each year was remitted by the Rosetta Decree, and meetings became less regular. decrees appear to have been passed at only about 1 meeting in 10. And there's no evidence of what was discussed at these other meetings or when exactly they took place, but they were part of an annual rhythm for almost 50 years in which priests from all over Egypt sailed down to the Nile to a meeting, usually held in Memphis or Alexandria, once in Canopus, of course. The dates of the assemblies that passed the decrees occurred in different months, although they generally appear to have avoided the harvest season, which would be a busy time of year for many priests and scribes involved with administrative duties connected to the Ptolemaic state revenue system. The dates of the undocumented annual meetings probably varied as well. So perhaps one order of business at all these unknown meetings was simply setting a time and place for the next meeting. And there's no way to know this, but I raise this because this basic necessity helps us to imagine the more ordinary activities that lie behind the heightened celebratory formal moments memorialized in the decrees. Now, in addition to the date, the decrees invariably mention the titles of those who assembled to pass them, and these included the lesones, or administrative supervisors of the temples, other high-ranking priests such as God's servants, and then temple scribes, and a generic category of other lower-ranking wab priests. And as I mentioned earlier, these priests take the place of the people, the demos, and the council, or the boule, in a Greek polis. Athens and some other cities also used motion formulas, which mention the speaker who introduced the decree into the assembly or council, but this was not the case in the priestly decrees. In these, the speaking and decision-making is always collective. No individual Egyptian priest is mentioned, and there are few details of procedure. And this emphasis on the collective agency of the priests suggests consensus, whatever may have happened in the actual meetings. Now, that these priests were understood as equivalent to the deliberative and sovereign body of a polis is clearest in one of the honors accorded to Ptolemy III in the Canopus decree of 238 BCE. The priests created a fifth tribe, or phule, of Egyptian priests named after the ruling couple, the Theoi-Euergetai. The Greek term phule, loosely translated in English as tribe, is equivalent to the Egyptian sa in the Demotic and the hieroglyphic versions. Owing to the Canopus decree, this Greek word is still often used as a modern translation for the Egyptian term, which from the earliest periods of Egyptian history designated groups of people providing part-time service in temples, work crews, and mortuary cults, usually in some sort of rotation system. In the temple context, the system was used to organize the service of non-permanent priests. So the equivalence between the two terms, the Greek term and this Egyptian term sa, was probably based on structural and functional analogies. The Greek tribes served, among other purposes, as constituent groups for the selection of counselors and also for the rotation of service in the prytanes, or the executive committees of the council, and also in certain magistracies and priesthoods. The Egyptian priests were also perhaps drawing on a precedent far from Canopus or Alexandria in enacting this particular honor. For example, in the excitement following the expulsion of Demetrius of Phalerum in 307-306 BCE, his expulsion from Athens, the Athenians added 2 new tribes to the 10 traditional Cleisthenic ones, and they named them after their liberators, Demetrius Poliorcetes and his father Antigonus the One-Eyed, who was soon to have himself declared a king, a basileus, during the wars of Alexander's successors. And about 14 years after the Canopus decree, the Athenians would give a similar honor to Ptolemy III, the same king honored in the Canopus decree, which was clearly taking part in a broader pattern of honors for kings. And finally, and most important for this particular discussion, I should say, is the place where each of the decrees was passed, and that's described also in these in the documents. Though we can't be sure about the undocumented annual meetings, they are always in temples in the surviving decrees, and I've got a little table of locations here. In the wider Mediterranean, it was less common for the meeting place of an assembly or council to be mentioned in the text of a decree, but occasionally a specialized assembly place, like an ecclesiasterion, is noted, or the city's theater, or the agora, or a special meeting hall in the case of a council, a bouleuterion. It's not usually a temple. It's very rare. The Ptolemaic decrees thus imply a commensuration, an equation between the Egyptian temple and the deliberative decision-making places of a Greek polis. Now, to narrow down the location of this place within the temple, we turn to the concluding instructions for publication. In the surviving Greek versions, the decree is to be inscribed on a stele in its 3 versions and placed in temples of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd ranks. And probably this means more or less all of them, at least in theory. And the location is then further specified in one of 2 ways. Either the stela is to be placed in the most conspicuous place, ento epiphenestato topo, or it is to be placed next to a statue that had been erected by a previous decree as an honor for the king. In the latter case, the instructions for the statue say that it is to be set up in the most conspicuous place in all the temples of Egypt, for example, in the Rosetta Stone. In the Philae 1 decree of 184 BCE, there is even a chain of references that builds on a previous decree of statues and decrees being placed one next to the other or in the same place. And the previous decree that the Philae decree refers to is the Memphis decree of 196 BCE, the Rosetta Stone. Now, the phrase ento epiphenestato topo is a standard expression in other Hellenistic honorific decrees that refers to a highly visible place, of course, and that's often further specified as of the city, of the agora, of a temple, and so forth. And honorary statues or decrees were often placed there. The Demotic translation of the term follows the Greek fairly closely at first glance. En pa ma'a neti wena en pa irpi, in the place that is open in the temple. Rather than this periphrasis, the hieroglyphic translation uses a more specific, even architectural term. The decrees are said to be placed or are instructed to be placed in the Weshet Mesha, the court of the people. Now, the court of the people refers to an open forecourt of a temple where lay people could meet the gods when they made their appearances in various festival processions, but it's also sometimes used in other contexts as well. This would make sense. This religious context would make sense of the Demotic periphrasis, which in its roundabout way captures the meaning of epiphanes, but also alludes to this ritual of appearance. The term wene, related, according to some, to wen hair or to opening the face, may refer to the epiphany that occurred in the forecourt of a temple when a procession of the god's image moved out the gates and along the dramos or processional way. On the other hand, the Demotic phrase is semantically similar to the term that I started with, the general term for the open place of the temple, including its accessible forecourts and the dramos, the uba or Coptic wopa, the open. Now, very few of the inscribed copies of the decrees have been discovered in controlled archaeological excavations, but about 20 years ago or so, a copy of the Canopus decree was discovered roughly in situ at the temple of Bubastis or Telbasta, and it was located at the entrance to the forecourt of the temple. And so there's a little zoom in so you can see the rough location. And so this is this open space here that I've been talking about here. Here's another example of it at Edfu. And I don't have slides here, or perhaps I got them out of order, but you can also see this in the Philae decree, which is inscribed on the wall of the birth house, which is also overlooking the forecourt of the temple of Isis at Philae. These and other forecourt areas of temples and the areas along the gate, at the gates and along the dramos, were indeed open areas to which non-priests, i.e. the people, had access, as we can tell from temple inscriptions at Edfu, for example, and in the Book of the Temple, a manual on the ideal form and personnel of Egyptian temples, which is under publication by Professor Clark. This open area was also a place where inscribed stele and statues honoring the pharaoh, priests, or other important persons were commonly placed. So the decrees placing statues there is part of an Egyptian tradition as well. Now, given this physical evidence that marked temple space, these translations in the decrees suggest that their discourse and the new political practice that generated them was making a commensuration between the open part of the temple as a public place under the control of a deliberative body, parallel to such places that were sites of and under the authority of councils or assemblies in Hellenistic Greek states. John Ma, for example, in his book on statues in cities, has argued that in Hellenistic city-states, honorific statues and the decrees that established them made the people's control over public space explicit in the process of allocating epiphanestatoi topoi for the statues of the city's benefactors. In other words, such honorific decrees not only presupposed public space as a given, but also contributed to producing and reproducing it through tangible and visible material practices that were also, of course, entangled in the city's economies and politics of ergotism. In the trilingual decrees, by comparison, an assembly of Egyptian priests was not only praising a Macedonian king for upholding a traditional pharaonic political, religious, and cosmic order by caring for the temples, they were also expressing their own authority over and in the open space of the temple. And they did so with statues at times, not only statues of kings, but also their own statues as well. And here's just a couple of diagrams I've been showing you that show the Book of the Temple and some correspondences with the Temple of Edfu. Joachim Kwak has shown actually that there's some correspondence in structure and phraseology between these two, and you can kind of create an ideal model, if you will, of the articulation of different spaces of the temple using those inscriptions on the Book of the Temple. Now, the epiphanestatos topos, or open place where inscribed versions of the decrees were erected, is not necessarily the same place where the priests assembled to pass the decrees, but it does seem plausible. Holding meetings in the inner recesses of the temple would have been difficult for practical and ritual reasons. A large number of priests would not fit into the inner rooms of most temples, and those parts of the god's house were also typically reserved for the high-ranking priests who officiated in the daily liturgy, according to the Book of the Temple. The lower-ranking priests mentioned in the decrees would not necessarily have had access to all of the spaces. There is also a broad tendency for inscriptions in Egyptian temples to reflect corresponding places of verbal enunciation. For example, temple statues that call out to priests passing by to recite a funerary formula, or hieroglyphic inscriptions that reflect the places of particular rituals that they are describing in the text. So the choice of the site for the inscribed decree may well have been intended to resonate with the original living discourse of the assembled priests. Now, this scenario is made even more plausible by evidence that Egyptian priests met in temples for deliberative and administrative purposes, and at times the forecourt or another open part of the temple is mentioned or implied. And just going to go ahead here. About 2 or 3 centuries before these decrees, as early as the Saite period, there's evidence of priests meeting in temples formally or informally in order to handle the administrative and economic affairs of the temple and to make collective decisions. In some cases, this work entailed communicating with representatives of the central state, whether the court of the pharaoh or the satrap when Egypt was under Achaemenid Persian rule. A few such meetings are described in a peculiar literary historical text known as the Petition of Petiesi, P. Rylands 9, composed in the reign of Darius I, but referring to events in the Saite period. This is a narrative text with literary flourishes in which the author, Petiesi, recounts the long history of his family's contested possession of a priesthood of Ammon and its income at Tiujo, or modern El Hibe, a dispute that stretches back some 5 generations. In one episode in the Saite period, the priests of this temple gather when grain offerings for Ammon were being collected in the temple forecourt, offerings which were to be distributed as income for the priests. These priests speak with one another and concoct a treacherous plan to attack the sons of Haruja, one of Petiesi's ancestors, when the youths come to collect Haruja's income. In the aftermath of this murderous assault, Haruja's father-in-law, an earlier Petiesi, gathers the support of military officials and intervenes to investigate the crime and set things right. This Petiesi then assembles the local priests who conspired against him in the temple to hear a dramatic speech in which he announces the measures that he will take to prevent such interference in the future. Clues in the speech and in the subsequent narrative suggest that this assembly and Petiesi's oration likely took place somewhere along the dromos, the processional way of the temple, and probably in the forecourt. Now, these are extraordinary events in the narrative, but assembling priests for the collection and disbursement of temple income was not, nor is a later episode in the petition of Petiesi, in which the priests of Amun assembled to choose a representative to carry a bouquet of flowers on behalf of their god alongside Semiticus II when he campaigned in Syria around 592 BCE. There's no mention of how or where this election was performed in the narrative, but a similar procedure was probably used to choose a temple's lasonus, or chief administrator, at least as early as the Persian period and possibly earlier. And in the Ptolemaic period, this election appears to have been held annually. More information on such procedures comes from an unusually detailed Ptolemaic text documenting the appointment of an individual to a different priestly office at Tebtunis in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. It says that the priests who made the decision sat or met Hemes in the court, the wesci of the temple. These priests are further identified as the counselor priests of the temple, a group that was actually mentioned in the Canopus decree as a deliberative body organized by the tribes, by the Philae, and expanded as a result of the addition of the 5th tribe. Now, the hypothesis that such elections took place in a temple courtyard is supported by evidence of other gatherings and deliberative sessions. Among the ostraca in the archive of Hor, for example, is a text that records a session, a hemes, of elder priests in the forecourt or westet of the temple of Ptah at Memphis in 172 BCE. And this meeting was about irregularities that had been discovered in the embalming of sacred ibises and hawks. The precise locations of these courts are difficult to determine as they usually have no modifier. But the fact that this council of elders summoned the servants of the ibises and the servants of the hawk, relatively low-ranking temple workers, to this court suggests that it was not an inner ritually restricted hall, but the forecourt of the temple. Just going to take a drink for a moment. It's also noteworthy that in a subsequent record from this affair, we hear that a council of 25 Wab priests, 5 from each Philae, instituted new procedures to regulate the embalming of the sacred birds. There is also a Demotic papyrus from Papyrus, around 30 kilometers south of Thebes, that records the minutes of a priestly meeting in the temple court during the joint reign of Cleopatra III and Ptolemy IX. These deliberative priestly councils largely dealt with internal affairs of the temple, but they were not islands unto themselves. At the meeting of the elders of the temple of Ptah at Memphis, for example, an agent of the king was present, the epistates, or overseer of the temple, and the priests also sent to the court at Alexandria to obtain clarification on points of law. The election of a lasonus, moreover, was subject to approval by the upper levels of the administration, and the documentation at times records correspondence related to that process. All these bits of evidence, from Persian period literary texts to Ptolemaic documents, show that the idea of a deliberative body of priests meeting in the open part of the temple and making decisions and communication with the royal court was not a fiction necessitated by the Hellenistic genre of the decrees. It was grounded in existing authoritative bodies and places. Now I'm going to change to another aspect of these decrees. Now, the Egyptian words that the decrees use to translate the Greek term for the genre point to another occasion in which priests deliberated in the open, the judicial proceeding or trial, which often took place at the gates of a temple. Immediately after the dating formula in the structure of the decrees comes a word that announces the genre, psephisma. It's a little unusual in Greek decrees to use this kind of label to indicate the genre of the text, and so it stands out. In the Demotic and hieroglyphic translations of this generic label, slightly different aspects of the term were selected in the process of translation. The hieroglyphic term used is sechau or sechawi, a substantive related to the verb remember or call to mind, and so perhaps remembrance, memorial, or memorandum, a term that's sometimes used for official reports and similar documents. The Demotic word ut, however, derives from the classical Egyptian uj, command, but this is usually used of gods and kings in earlier texts, certainly. In Demotic, however, the term has developed a wider semantic range. It was used for written documents in legal cases, including a written decision that judges produced for the successful party. This is attested, for example, in the Hermopolis Legal Code, a Demotic Egyptian legal manual written in the first half of the 3rd century BCE. And the templates for such documents, which are provided in the manual, even use the label ut at the beginning of each document, similar to the pattern in the Ptolemaic decrees. This term is also found in a transcript of an actual legal proceeding from Siut to refer to the legal decree or decision of the judges. There is a further parallel between the priestly decrees and legal decrees in their respective motives section, the considerations that lead to the judgment or decision. The Greek term epede in the honorific decrees is translated in Demotic as engeret heperef, or when or since it happened. And this phrase is also used in the Siut trial transcript and in another one from Sharuna to introduce the factors on which the judges based their decision. The judges in the Sharuna and Siut trials that I've been referring to, and in others, met at the gates of the temple. Following a tradition going back at least to the New Kingdom, the people of Egypt could come before panels of priests serving as judges and seek the enactment of legal order, or to put it on a cosmic level, the enactment of Ma'at, the Ma'at which the ideal pharaoh guaranteed. A fundamental study by Serge Soneron in 1954, as well as a series of further studies over the last 20 years or so, have provided several examples of temple gates that were referred to as the Route di Ma'at, or the Gate of Giving Justice in the Ptolemaic period, along with testimony that courts of Egyptian judges, in Greek known as the Laokritai, the judges of the people, did indeed convene there. One of the most evocative of these sites was a gate erected under Ptolemy III, contemporary with our first decree, at the entry to the sanctuary of Khonsu at Karnak. Like many such gates, it's covered with relief sculptures showing offering scenes. In this case, the traditional scene of the offering of Ma'at is quite prominent, inscribed in 4 variants on the north and south sides of the lintel, in a symmetrical mirroring layout on both sides of the axis of the entryway. On the south side, Ptolemy III is shown offering a little figure of the goddess Ma'at to the divine triad Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, while on the north side, Ptolemy III and his queen Berenike II make the offering to Khonsu and Hathor. In the scene shown in this slide, Khonsu's epithets assimilate him to Thoth, lord of Ma'at. They allude to Thoth's judicial aspects. And the inscriptions on the gate are filled with mythological references to scenes of judgment, creating what Philippe Deschamps called the colorful paysage judicaire, a judicial landscape, in which Khonsu assimilated to Thoth. Sorry, software wanted to update. So Philippe Deschamps referred to these evocations as a judicial landscape in which Khonsu, assimilated to Thoth, heads a divine tribunal that ultimately decides in favor of the legitimacy of Horus, in a version of the great myth of the contendings of Horus and Seth, which culminated in a trial over the succession to the throne of Osiris. Descriptions of the trial of Horus and Seth, a paradigm for any legal conflict and for the victory of truth, justice, or Ma'at, are also inscribed at other temple gates. For example, the pylon of the temple of Edfu, which was completed along with the forecourt in 70 BCE under Ptolemy II. And these are mythical memories which may have underpinned the authority of jurisdiction at these sites, as well as individual affective experiences of somebody participating in a trial at one of these courts at the gate of the temple. This was certainly so, I would say, for the elites who could read hieroglyphs and or Demotic literature, but perhaps also for non-elites too, the same can be said. The cycle of myths was of the trial of Horus and Seth was ubiquitous and not confined to the literate. It could be perhaps experienced as a dramatic performance in the open areas of the temple that were accessible to the non-priestly population. And so to that degree, the trial of Horus and Seth, enacted as a ritual drama, could perhaps be compared to Athena's foundation of the Areopagus as a homicide court in Aeschylus's Eumenides. Now, unlike most temple constructions, we actually know an individual responsible for at least some of the work on the gate of Ptolemy III, the Khonsu temple. The biographical inscriptions of Amasis, son of Smendes, on a statue found in the Karnak cachette reports that he inscribed the gateway of Khonsu at Thebes. Amasis was an important member of the Theban priestly elite, and his biographical inscriptions refer to him traveling north to the palace in Alexandria and then sailing back down the Nile to Hermopolis with a royal decree in order to carry out a mission of arbitration between groups of priests there. He also alludes to his own judicial activity in a prayer to Mut, the mother of Khonsu, saying, "May you cause my enclosure or chamber, Ofet, to endure at the gate of giving justice." This may have referred to a shelter or an enclosure of a more ephemeral kind that was erected at the gates of the temple to serve as a semi-formal place for judges to hold their sessions, possibly on the north side of the gate where it was shady. A somewhat more formal construction like this was built onto the front of the pylon of the Temple of Montu at Medamud during the late Ptolemaic or early Roman period. This consisted of a raised platform with columns that supported a canopy of some lighter material, perhaps wood or cloth. And a text on the enclosure gate built under Tiberius refers to this as a route dimat, a gate of giving justice. The snippets from the biography of Amasis, along with the gate he inscribed, allow us to see a bit more deeply into the material production of this site of deliberation and local authority at the gates of the temple, a place that was produced in this case through local patronage, the celebration of idealized real pharaonic and Ptolemaic backing for the dispensation of justice, and through mythical memorializations. Now, a little more, excuse me, a little more information on these sites of legal deliberation is available from transcripts of trials before the Laocritai that I mentioned earlier. The most extensive of these is a transcript of a lawsuit concerning a disputed inheritance that took place in 170 BCE in Siut, or Nicopolis, at a place that was called the House of Judgment, Awi and Wepi, before a panel of 3 judges composed of priests of Wepwawet and of the gods who dwell with them, namely the sequence of Ptolemies named in the dynastic cult. Though the House of Judgment is not specifically located in the Temple of Wepwawet in this text, it seems probable that it was a place in the temple precinct, possibly a special structure like the one mentioned in the Amasis inscription. In the other transcript that I mentioned from Sharuna or Koma Ahmar, dated to 117-116 BCE, the trial is described as taking place before the judges who were sitting in the judgment house, which is in the Hathor temple of Sharuna. In the Siut case, there is also mention of a related proceeding that took place nearby before judges at a temple of Imhotep at Teshma. There are a number of fascinating aspects to the Siut transcript, including a brief reference to a prior attempt to arbitrate the inheritance dispute at issue by elders of an association who met, as we might expect, on the dramos of the temple. This arbitration is another way in which the open area of the temple was adopted as the site for deliberation and decision-making, in this case by groups not directly connected to the state or the temple. That's, of course, another story. The open part of the temple was eventually recognized as a place of legal deliberation and jurisdiction by representatives of the Ptolemaic state. At first, by those that worked alongside the Laocritai, and then those functioning independently. As in the trilingual decrees, there was a commensuration made between the practical and spatial aspects of Greek law courts and Egyptian ones, but in this case, it becomes visible through practice rather than translation. Although the Laocritai were notionally judges with a limited jurisdiction that was, depending on whom you ask, determined by the ethnicity of the parties or the language of the contract, they worked alongside representatives of the Greek legal system instituted by the Ptolemies. Sitting alongside the priests of Wepwawet at Siut and the priests of Hathor at Sharuna was an official known even in Demotic documents by the Greek title Aesagogius, the introducer. In composition, then, the court at the gates of the temple was very similar to a Greek dikasterion in Ptolemaic Egypt, 3 judges and an Aesagogius. In fact, in the transcript of the trial of Hermias, a trial before Greek judges or krematistai, there's a panel of Laocritai mentioned, and it's described as a dikasterion. The Aesagogius in the Siut trial acts as an observer and does not pass judgment, but it is his agent or bailiff who's charged with carrying out the decree of the court when the trial is concluded. It's also been argued that the Aesagogius was the official who constituted the court. The Aegyptologius at the Siut trial was a certain Andromachus, although at the Sharuna trial, the same official has an Egyptian name. Now, regardless of names or possible ethnicities, these officials had to be able to work between the two primary cultures and languages of Ptolemaic Egypt. Since the Siut trial began with the complainant petitioning the strategoi, or the governors of the district of Siut and of the Nome, and asking them to write to the judges to hear her plea, it may have been the Aegyptologius who brought the case before the Laocritai. Just as in the contemporary meeting of the Council of Priests in the forecourt of the Temple of Ptah at Memphis that I mentioned earlier, an agent of the pharaoh served as a bodily link between the court seated in the temple's authoritative open space and the central administration. These legal practices and the acts of translation that they required may have led some participants to recognize the non-religious function of the open part of the temple, as analogous to central places in a Greek city-state where law courts would meet, for example, an agora. Now, by the later 2nd century BCE, this practice of jurisdiction in the open had been adopted by officials of the Ptolemaic state. Over the course of the 2nd century BCE, there was a gradual shift in legal authority from Laocritai, and also perhaps the Crematistai, to officials of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy, and an increasing tendency for individuals to seek legal redress by submitting petitions to these officials. Strategoi, or nome governors, were called on to address legal complaints, and though they continued to refer matters to the courts, they could and did sometimes take action themselves. And in an important article, Jan Kwageber pointed out evidence that in the later 2nd century BCE, the strategos could receive petitions at the gates of the temple. A papyrus dated 132 BCE from Soknopionessos in the Fayum refers to a petition made by priests there to the strategos Apollonius at the Premet. And this, by the word deduced, is a Greek transliteration of Pa Ra Mehit, or the northern gate, that is the northern and perhaps shadier gate of a temple where the courts met. Now, this image of a 2nd century Ptolemaic strategos dispensing justice in the open, the gate of an Egyptian temple, offers an intriguing counterpart to the image with which we began, an assembly of Egyptian priests meeting at a temple to deliberate and pass a Hellenistic decree, adopting the role of a polis, while also embodying and alluding to existing Egyptian practices of administrative, political, and legal deliberation in the open, the accessible parts of an Egyptian temple. After the grand tradition of trilingual decrees had already lapsed, an official of the Greek administration, the Greek, quote unquote, was now occupying a traditional Egyptian place of authoritative deliberation in order to receive petitioners and dispense justice, or assign that task to the Laocritai, who continued to meet there, or even perhaps to the Greek Crematistai, whose place of jurisdiction remains elusive in our existing records. So the decrees emerged as a practice in the open in the 3rd century and then disappeared in the 2nd. But in the process of making approximations between Greek practices and Egyptian, the decrees and the practice of assembling to pass them illuminated long-standing practices of the open as a place of deliberation and decision-making that existed before the decrees and continued afterwards. So I would like to conclude this little exploration with a couple of questions that it could raise about what the context of the open can say about the decrees and what the decrees can tell us about this open part of the temple. In the first case, in what capacity did priests imagine that they were passing decrees to honor the Ptolemies? This contextualization of the decrees and their language shows that they exhibited some circumspection about the nature and extent of their authority vis-a-vis the king. That is, they don't pass commands or decrees and uj. But there's also a subtle assertion that they did have their own traditions of deliberation and decision-making, even if these were not quite the same as those of Apollos. These included the capacity to manage local affairs of the temple, including its economic affairs, but also to serve as judges and arbitrators for their wider communities. And if the latter is the case, and the priests were alluding to this capacity, were they not also tacitly sitting in judgment of the king and considering his historical actions as worthy of honor or not, in accordance with long-standing principles of Ma'at that should govern the actions of the king? Now, on the other hand, what can this exploration of the decrees tell us about the open, this open part of the temple on a more concrete level? If these accessible areas of temples in towns and cities throughout Egypt were central places for both priests and sometimes non-priests, and they served as not only as sites of collective ritual, but also as sites of deliberation, for the elite at least, and legal jurisdiction and arbitration for a wider part of society, this begs questions about the comparability of these places to other central urban places in other Mediterranean societies, such as the agora, or the forum, and why the latter are so obvious to us, while the open has been relatively neglected. But that, as they say, is another story, one that I'm taking up at greater length in the book. And so I'd like to stop there and thank you very much for your attention to my talk.
Sorry. Yes, well, thank you very much, Ian. It was a wonderful paper, and I feel I've learned so much about something which I knew nothing about. I was wondering, well, incidentally, I'm now opening the floor to our guests to ask questions, and if people don't feel comfortable in talking in front of everyone, you can put questions and comments in the chat as well, and we'll read them out. I was wondering, I mean, you traced the whole role of the open back as far, I guess, as the Saite period, and I was wondering, I was wondering whether there's evidence for it in earlier times, and or whether this is something like, you know, you in your book you wrote very much about the priests taking on, the Egyptian priests taking on the, you know, functions that the pharaohs had in the earlier system as the you know, the pharaonic system collapsed, and that the cultural memory of Egypt was very much located in the priests from the 6th century BC onwards. I mean, is this kind of independent mindedness of the priests something which develops in the late period, and if so, you know, was it a kind of tradition then that it seems like a kind of tradition then that the Ptolemies had to engage with as they attempted to solidify their own regime.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for starting off with that question, that big picture question, which is one of the things I'm hoping to address more fully in the book. Yeah, I do think it's really difficult to make sharp periodizations with this material, but I think that's actually also the point, that clearly the forecourt areas of the temple, people have argued as early as the New Kingdom, certainly, and possibly earlier, were more accessible sites of a public nature for ritual performance. There are also evidence, there's also evidence of courts sometimes meeting in those areas. And so you can't draw a hard line that this never happened before and it only happened after, and so forth. But I do think there's a gradual transformation that does happen in the first millennium BCE through a number of factors that I think a number of people have written about in various ways. One is, of course, there is no longer this strong centralized state apparatus of the New Kingdom that declines in the disruptions of the Third Intermediate Period. And so various local administrative functions are taken on by the literate indigenous elites at the town and nome level, and the institutional infrastructure of the temple plays a greater role in just managing business. But there's also cultural dimensions to that, as well, as the priests, as you mentioned, become the preservers of various traditions. And they often, another aspect of the book that I'll be looking into is that the role that these local elites start to play a more prominent role in the construction of temples themselves. You see more evidence of inscriptions that celebrate the role of local benefactors in constructing or renovating temple spaces. And so it happens in a number of different ways. They have to take responsibility in an economic, material way, in a cultural way as well. The political significance, if you will, of the temple spaces changes, I think, subtly in the first millennium BCE, in part through things you mentioned, Herodotus and my earlier interest in Herodotus. I could point back to that scene that I explored a long time ago now, of the Herodotus meeting these Egyptian priests at Thebes who recite genealogies based on these statues. Well, as I talked about a long time ago, those statues have these genealogies, and those genealogies are there in part for as part of a archaizing turn to the past, but also for very pragmatic purposes in the present when those statues were put up and in subsequent generations. That is to defend access to priestly title, which becomes part of the contest and is, not unrelated to, well, very closely connected to texts like the Petition of Petiesi, where you start to see the disputes and documentation of access to the privilege of temple priesthoods being partly conducted in this open area, the central space, the accessible part of the public part of temples. So I think those are a couple of answers where I'd say that although certainly these spaces existed before and did have important functions that were more popular, we might say, their significance gradually transforms over the course of the first millennium under a series of pressures, cultural, economic, and political circumstances. I hope that wasn't too much. Sorry.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, that was really illuminating and very interesting. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Does anyone else want to raise a point?
Looks like it's all fixed. I've cleared it up. It's settled then. No, I'm sure.
Can I just butt in with a quick question?
Absolutely.
Sorry about my voice. When you showed the plan of the Temple of Edfu, and you talked about the open court, it seemed to be divided into two sections, and it wasn't entirely clear to me if what these two. The plan said there is another group for the more outside part of the court. How does it work?
Well, that's a tricky one. Let me see if I can share the slides again, and I can try to put that slide up and talk a bit more about that. That might be the easiest way to do this.
Okay.
So first, let me get to the slide. I know the one you're talking about. Here we go, and then I will share this one. And
yeah, that's the one. The court
the
for
one?
Another group sounded a bit enigmatic.
Yeah, well, this is that part is based on a book that's or a group of texts that Joachim Koch has been working on, known as the Book of the Temple, and from the publications that I've seen so far, and I'll have to maybe consult with Professor Koch about this more closely. But there are parts of the temple towards its more open public side that are described as various kinds of courts with different functions. And one of them is mentioned as the court of the people. And that seems to, according to the text, be just outside of the main pylon gate. And then there may be another court that Professor Koch has noted may be designated for another group of some kind. And that's about all we know. But it does appear that in this kind of idealized vision of the architecture of the temple and its functions, there were spaces that were understood to be areas associated not with the priests, but with other groups of people, not, more lay people perhaps. And so between looking at what we can see from inscriptions in the Temple of Edfu, for example, where there are inscriptions around this area labeled as the offering court that refer to people entering and going out on festive occasions. We know that that area was accessible at least some of the time to people, and that if we then expand our view using the Book of the Temple, that it could be that the area outside of the gates of the Edfu Temple was known as a court of the people. And there may have been others. Not every temple follows exactly the outline of the Book of the Temple, and the designation of spaces varies considerably, especially during the construction history of a temple. as different
That's right.
spaces become more and less exclusive as more parts are added on and so forth. But I would say that, it's important for my discussion of the functions of these spaces is trying to understand that there were gradations of access to different parts of the temple. And that especially in those public areas, various more what we might understand as public functions, not just of a religious nature, were taking place. And so this is, this diagram represents a kind of, a hybrid structure of or articulation of the space based in part on the Edfu temple and part on the Book of the Temple. But I see a couple of hands have popped up, and there may be some experts who actually know much more about this than I do, and I would be glad for their insights.
Yeah,
Should I leave this up or should I take this down? People, maybe we'll see what the question is, and then I can.
Well, let's see.
Let's leave it.
So I think David Wheeler was the first to put his hand up.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. This is really interesting, and I'll preface my question that I apologize. I don't know much about the Book of the Temple, but I'm wondering, are these various uschet that you're explaining, are the divisions just spatial or geographic, or are they also potentially temporal? Are there similar spaces, for example, that might be sort of the court of the people sort of in one temporal moment, either, if that's a time period during the reign of a certain pharaoh, or do these spaces fluctuate for different events and ceremonies as well?
I think it could be both. And it's, I think it's, in trying to understand the space, I've moved away from some earlier studies that really tried to put fixed labels on particular parts of the temple because there is so much variation and inconsistency. And in some cases, as I started looking into it, it was, I think the case, as you mentioned, that as a temple was built over time, a new structure was often added towards the front of the temple, and correspondingly, the structures and the uses of the spaces would change over time. Edfu is a great example. It's built over a very long period of time, and there's some evidence in the changing descriptions of the spaces of the temple that they had somewhat different functions as the temple got bigger, and there was more space available for different things. And that would include both the interior ritual spaces and the exterior spaces. As they became larger, they became articulated in somewhat different ways. But then it is also true, the other case that you mentioned, that is that some places, especially these closed areas like what's labeled here, the offering court at Edfu, it was possible to close them off. They were more restricted. And so access to them would be presumably temporally variable, and maybe only accessible at times for specific ceremonies and so forth. On the other hand, people may have gone to do business in these offering courts with scribes, because there may have been scribes offering particular services in an offering court. So those are harder to find. Those kinds of more ephemeral activities are harder to find because they're not documented very well in temple inscriptions or the Book of the Temple or something like that, and have to be inferred a little bit from documentary sources, which may occasionally mention, the signing of a contract on the dramas of a temple or something like that, that give us insights into some of those more everyday rhythms that the open parts of a temple would participate in. So I'm sorry I can't be super clear, but I would say sort of yes, both and that's the trick of trying to figure out, well, what's going on in these spaces, is using all the clues we can to figure out how the space was articulated, both in general terms, but also in its temporal rhythms. Space studies in cultural geography have shown us that temporality and spatiality really do intersect, and that spatial functions are often overlapping and contested. So thank you for that question. I'm not sure I really answered it, but thank you.
Yes. David, do you have any reply or comment to make? Or
Nope, that was great. Thank you.
okay. Yeah, we have a question from Alexandra von Leven.
Well, thank you very much. It's not so much a question actually, but I think Joachim isn't here, unfortunately, but I tried to remember a little bit, because the interesting point is, of course, that in the Book of the Temple, this ideal temple it describes is, of course, well, probably it was actually the one in Memphis, but there we don't have much archaeology left. But the interesting thing is that this temple is described with actually, if I remember, it was 4 pylons, so it was rather huge. And those pylons, of course, would be the border between the different courts. And the courts were designed for different types of people. So the priests, of course, could go very much inwards, but other people had to stay outside. But those outside were also differentiated into men and women. Women were not allowed to go as far in as men, and then foreigners had to stay even more outside, which interestingly, in a way, is a bit resembling certain things we know about the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which again is probably not by chance, because they might have taken their model from Egyptian things. But so clearly these things were definitely defined for something, but it's very difficult to connect all this with what we have from Greco-Roman Egypt. But of course, the Book of the Temple, at least if you go by historical linguistics, is not from the Greco-Roman period, but much older, which fits the fact that it has the 4 and not 5 philae. And the other thing is, of course, we always think we know so much and we have so many wonderful temples, but actually most important temples we know nothing about, and there is nothing preserved. So it's very likely that there were actually also in the Greco-Roman period, especially maybe in the Delta, temples which had so many pylons and courts, or in other places, maybe they wanted them and they didn't manage to, because at some point the pharaonic or the, say, pagan period was at an end. So it's very difficult to argue with what we have preserved, but the Book of the Temple gives, of course, an ideal, which is not necessarily what we find actually. Nevertheless, as you said, it's very interesting to compare the ideal with what we actually have. And as Joachim Quack has been able to show, at least for some things already, there is a quite good connection and it fits quite well. So clearly people tried to orient themselves on this thing, which also fits, of course, the fact that we have already from such a relatively unimportant place like Tunis so many manuscripts.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and it's good to see you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I certainly was following Professor Kwak's work on the Book of the Temple. Of course, he's really the expert on this, and also his work comparing the Edfu Temple to the Book of the Temple. He's written an article on that, and I think you raised really important methodological points about the difficulties involved in trying to reconstruct the space. Absolutely, it's an idealized space in the Book of the Temple. And that gives us an idea for thinking about how the space or place of the temple was idealized and imagined. And in that idealized version, there is an articulation of spaces where certain people get access to certain parts and certain activities are in those parts. And then it's interesting to compare it, as you say, to what we have on the ground when we have enough evidence, and show that there are efforts at kind of, if not matching the letter of the law than the spirit of the law in terms of articulating spaces where people may stand. I think, and yeah, you mentioned the earlier. This was probably referring to earlier periods. I think the number of courts extending out multiple courtyards really reminds one of the great temples at Karnak with all their endless, court after court after court, and those are certainly of an earlier period. But those two, fluctuated, it seems, in their function over time in some cases. There's evidence of that. So it's I think very productive, though, to try to see that there were idealized versions of the space. Then there was how they were put into practice by actual in constructions of temples of various kinds, and there may be local traditions involved too. But also there is how people actually used them, despite the, or whether that was in alignment with the traditions and prescriptions of the temple or the book of the temple, and whether it was not, because we also know that there are places. One thing I find fascinating is the subject of the pastophorion, or these little temple houses that are erected in kind of the more open areas of the temple, and they're supposed to be for priests. They're supposed to be priests' dwellings, but when you look at the documentary material, there's a study of this recently, and unfortunately I'm blanking on the name of the author, that showed that, well, some in the documentary record they were sometimes owned by priests, usually owned by priests, but not always, and so forth. And so we get a more of a realistic view of like space, idealized space, attempts to approximate it, and also attempts to kind of circumvent the the ideal of the space of the temple. And that's what makes all of this so interesting as a study in space and place and how it was made through multiple agents. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. As far as the Pastophoros is concerned, of course, it's funny to think that, well, people thought, maybe probably because of the Greek documents, that this was such a priestly title, but actually, Joachim Quack and Friedhelm Hoffmann have, of course, shown that it's corresponding to Iriaa, which is simply the gatekeeper.
Yes.
Well,
true. No, they're really not priests exactly. They're more sort of temple workers that kind of take care of the business of these open parts of the temple. And so it's interesting that there's a kind of a class of people that is tied to this kind of open area of the temple. If I'm understanding their work correctly, they're guardians of this kind of space, and they do the various kinds of work in this space.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thanks, both of you. Anyway, we have one more. We have a question from Anastasia Maravela.
Hello. Hi,
Hi,
Anastasia.
Ian.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. How are
Good to see you. Doing well, thank you. And you?
Good. Thank you for this very interesting talk. I really liked your general approach and how you try to kind of show how this space at the forecourts or around the gates, by the gates, takes over the functions of space in Greek. But from my point of view, it is not probably a question, but maybe an observation, something for you to think if you haven't thought about it. I was looking up the expression en epiphanestato topo, which I mean, I'm not an epigraphist, so don't take what I say for certain. Check it out, but it looks like it is also new in the Greek practice. So it is not much earlier. I didn't find that many attestations before the 3rd century. So this is also a new kind of expression, and probably, as you said, connected to the culture of Euvergetism that kind of emerges at that time. So maybe the fact that it is new makes it kind of easier to attach it to something that is foreign and perhaps flexible. And it's not only connected to the agora, but they speak about, also temples. There are the expression in the most prominent place of the temple or of the gymnasium or of the agora and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point about the newness of this term and how it fits into the newly emergent world of, kings and cities and elite benefactors in cities and the emergent Hellenistic culture of Euergetism. That's great. I didn't bring that out, but I think it does speak to the way in which the Egyptian priests are, au courant, if you will, with contemporary phraseology and thinking about, in contact with a wider network of political discourses, observing it, incorporating it, and adapting these kind of international, transnational, discourses, cosmopolitan political languages, and then connecting it with their own particular tradition and situation. So I think, I think that does, and then taking that and then seeing how it's translated in quite different ways in the into the Demotic and then into the hieroglyphic is helpful for us understanding how this term was adapted to local circumstances. It's a term that, you're right, is part of it. It often the references to inscription and publishing an inscription are often tied to these clauses or stipulations in Hellenistic decrees of hortatory intention, they're sometimes called, the kind of intention to show proper gratitude to the benefactors of a community. And it's sometimes literally spelled out, so that we may be seen to be showing proper gratitude to people, let us put this statue in this decree in the most prominent and visible place of the city. And so that visibility is very much tied into this as a kind of public act of material communication. And so it's interesting to see how the practice of translation in the decrees is working with that and very aware of that. And then in translating, not only, as I say, between languages, but between places and spaces, like literally a translatio between places. So thank you. That's a great observation. I made it. I don't know if you saw me writing, but I wrote that down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anastasia. That was great. Yeah, do we have any other questions? I just wanted to ask about this whole concept of Euergetism, because you mentioned in your answer, the answer that you gave to my first question, that we find in the late period, the Egyptian elites are getting more involved in sort of demonstrative public foundations of things, and so there seems to be a pre-existing culture of elite Euergetism in Egypt even before the Ptolemies arrive and start reorganizing things.
Yeah, well, this has been one of the journeys of this project, which has taken different forms, and as I've been picking at it for a long time now, it is the realization that tacit or explicitly understood periodizations about when a particular form of practice arrives in Egypt have over and over again been challenged by digging a little further. And it's not that they're all of them go back to the deepest recesses of Egyptian history. They're often things that are also, late period, manifestations. I think that's certainly one of them. And the emergence of it is for quite different political and social reasons, but nevertheless, there was a practice that could be equated between these two of benefactions to the temples by private individuals. And so the place to look for this is there's as many people I'm sure know, there's a wonderful chapter on this in Christelle Fisher-Beauvais' book on Army and Society in Ptolemaic Egypt, where she really goes through the models of Euergetism for the Ptolemaic period. But it's also worth pointing out that and I think she and others have noticed that there were also Egyptian elites, prominent officials, sometimes also army officers of the late period armies, who are seen in inscriptions contributing funds or overseeing and managing the construction of additions to temples and so forth, and advertising that through these inscriptions to their fellow elite literate peers, of course, but advertising it nonetheless, and showing that they played a role in that.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Well, if not, perhaps we can let Ian take his well-deserved rest. But yeah, thank you so much for this. It was really, really illuminating and fascinating, and the best of luck from all of us with the with finishing the book. We can't wait to read it.
Thank you so
Anyway.
much, and thank you all. Thank you for inviting me to join in this, and thank you all for your comments and questions, and most of all, simply for listening. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so next month I just wanted to sorry, I just wanted to announce our next talk, which is by Caitlin Barrett from Cornell University. She'll be talking about household archaeology to the domestication of empire, Egyptian landscapes of Pompeii next month about this time. We'll be announcing it in the next few days. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. And we'll looking forward to seeing you there.